In this video, I'm going to walk you through the reproductive systems and hope to teach you on the female reproductive anatomy, sex hormones, ovarian and menstrual cycles, and uterine environments, and how to fertilize eggs. Step by step, and be sure to watch the entire video. My name is Philip Pador, founder of NCLEX RN 45-Day Challenge, where we give you the tips and the resources that you need to totally pass your NCLEX in 45 days and become the best nurse that you can be. Maybe you noticed that every time we talked about a new systems, we highlighted the importance by saying how you die without it. Like without the muscular and skeletal systems would collapse into another bag of goo. Or if we magically remove your respiratory or circulatory systems, you die in a couple of minutes because your cells wouldn't have oxygen. That's because most of our body systems are just trying to keep us alive minute to minute. But one of those systems doesn't really care if you live or die, but it doesn't really kick in until puberty. And even then, it's more concerned about investing the future than keeping you alive. When it comes to reproductive systems, it's not concerned about you as much as it's concerned about your alleles or your genetic code and the future of the human species, which are no small stakes. The system includes our primary internal sex organs, the gonads like testes and ovaries, the various sex hormones they secrete, and the gametes, sperms, and eggs they produce. It also includes the glands of ducts, external genitalia, and particular brain parts, works that help the gonads and the gametes do what they need to do, which is basically a mate. It's a combined alleles and make babies. Now, all animals have their own particular fascinating anatomical methods for getting their gametes together, and we could do a whole course just on that and never run out of materials, but we may seem kind of tame compared to animals that turn the bright red or bite off penises or starve themselves for a chance to breathe, or systems are still pretty complex. In fact, most of the month, to get through all of the various anatomical parts and hormones and explain how sexy time is, fertilization, pregnancy, and development work starting today with the female anatomy. I remember, and this is nothing to be shy about when talking about sex. You're talking about the future of humanity. Do you want to talk about sex? We're talking about spreading our alleles around, but when we visualize sex, most of what we picture are anatomy. Who has what and what goes where in an anatomical female that involves the vulva, which includes the mons pubis, over the pubic bone, and labia majora and labia minora along its skin fold that surrounds the vestibules, which contains both the urethral and vaginal opening. Beyond that is the vagina, which I'm sure you know is how menstrual blood and babies leave the body and how the sperm gets in. But as much as we tend to put all the focus on the bathing suits parts, those are the only genitalia, the external sexual organs. And they're really just means of getting gametes together reproductively speaking. They're at least important parts of the system. The ground control the female reproductive anatomy. In the place the orders are given are of course the ovaries. Their main job is to produce and release the female gametes and sex hormones like estrogen and progesterone. You remember from biology that gametes are haploid cells, meaning that they only have one set of chromosomes and are formed by meiosis. Sperms and fuses with an egg, and they make a diploid cell which has all the genetic instructions required. It's pretty much everything about how a reproductive system works as designed to make it happen. Each ovary lives inside a fibrous sac that consists of the layers of connective tissues called the tunica albuginea, and another layer of cuboidal epithelium cells called germinal epithelium, which is actually part of the peritoneum that lies in the abdominal cavity. The ovary itself contains the cortex that houses its developing eggs, and the medulla contains most of the ovaries, blood vessels, and the nerves. The business of passing all alleles and saving the humanity really begins in the basic reproductive unit. To the cortex, to the ovarian follicles, these are the tiny sac-like structures that each hold a single primary oocyte to sort of incomplete proto-egg along with a bunch of supporting follicles around it. Females are born with essentially all of these early versions of eggs in all of the primordial follicles. They will ever have around 1 million at the time of the birth. Right around birth, the oocytes stop developing, they get stuck at the first stage of meiosis, and they stay that way for years and sometimes forever. The actual process of egg creations or oogenesis is delayed until puberty, when the rest of the body is physically ready to reproduce. This works different for us. For some animals, like if you're a salmon or a mayfly, then all of your eggs full mature at once and then you'll make reproduce and usually die in quick succession. I mean, people talk about living fast and dying young, but then that's too fast. So humans mature one by one, almost constantly doled out, so that every month or solo mature egg is either fertilized or dies to make way for a new egg. This is all sound familiar if you were born with the female anatomy or you know anyone who has, because it's a big part of the well-known monthly menstrual cycle. But the truth is, menstruation is only one part of the one cycle. The menstrual cycle is what happens in the uterus to prepare for a fertilized egg. The other cycle, the ovarian cycle, is all about the maturation of the follicle and egg, and it's what actually drives the menstrual cycle. Every day, even before Earth, bunch of follicles will begin a process of maturation, very slowly morphing from primordial follicles into what known as late tertiary follicles, which are the ones that will support a fully developed egg. This process takes 375 days. But all of that bunch of follicles, usually about 20 years or so, only one follicle will end up supporting a single mature egg. The rest will get the hormonal boost they need to bring the egg to completion. This is what happens. I keep mentioning puberty, which you've probably been through yourself. It should come as no surprise that all of this activity is regulated by sex hormones. Starting around puberty, the hypothalamus pituitary set up two concurrent cycles. The ovarian cycles of the ovaries, which ripens eggs and secretes hormones, and the menstrual cycle or the uterine cycle, which prepares the uterus to capture and nourish any mature fertilized eggs. When puberty begins, the hypothalamus starts up with the ovarian cycle by secreting gonadotropin-releasing hormone about once a month. This is a sex hormone that stimulates the anterior pituitary to release two more hormones. The follicle-stimulating hormone, you often hear it's called the FSH, and the luteinizing hormone, or the LH. The follicle-stimulating hormone lives up to its name by stimulating the growth of a follicle. The only one that happens to be the furthest along in development. At the time, the follicle-stimulating hormone, or the FSH, drives that one lucky follicle to keep growing by triggering the follicle itself to secrete its own estrogen hormone, which locally assigned the follicle to mature even more. That surge of follicles secrete estrogen that ends up stimulating the pituitary to secrete another pulse of luteinizing hormone to finish the job. The luteinizing hormone gets to work on the oocyte that's been dormant inside the follicle and triggers it to finally start dividing again, giving it to complete meiosis 1 and move on to the metaphase 2. This whole process takes about 14 days, at the end of which the follicle, which is now mature, pushes up against the ovary wall, ruptures, and with the help of enzymes, breaches the wall and ejects a single male mature oocyte. But then the follicle now slows its estrogen production while morphing it into different structures called the corpus luteum. First, it releases its final hormonal swan song, a bunch of progesterone, a little bit of estrogen, and some inhibit that together stops the release of the follicle-stimulating hormone and the LH, or the luteinizing hormone. They also prepare the uterus to receive the oocyte, which is now on the way down to the fallopian tube, where it might meet a nice young sperm. The tubes are about 10 centimeters long and interestingly actually connected to the ovaries. This means that when the egg pushes through the ovary, it has to float the short way through the peritoneal cavity before it's caught up by a fallopian tube. Now only if and when an egg fuses with the sperm does it actually complete meiosis to and officially become an ovum. Whether it's fertilized or not, the end it works its way down the tube and it tilts it through. The uterus, a hollow, Walden, very stretchable muscular organ that sits anterior to the rectum and posterior superior to the bladder and ends with the cervix. The uterine wall is composed of 3 layers: the perimetrium on the outside of the bulky smooth muscle myometrium that contracts during labor, and the inner mucosal lining that contracts during a labor, and the inner mucosal lining, the endometrium, which consists of a thin, deep basal layer and then the functional layer. If a fertilization does happen, that the new embryo snuggles into the endometrium for gestation, but the uterus is only receptive to implantation for a short period of time, about 1 week after ovulation. But the egg isn't fertilized, that outer functional layer sloughs off, and that's the first phase of the uterine or menstrual cycle. The series of changes at the endometrium goes through every 28 days or so in response to changing hormones levels in the coordinations with the ovarian cycle. Shredding of the functional areas triggered when the progesterone and the estrogens that were being produced by the corpus luteum starts to drop about 10 days after ovulation. This phase lasts about 5 days. Meanwhile, the FSH and the LH released from the anterior pituitary start to rise again in the stimulating next round of follicles, which begins to make estrogen. Heralds the start of the phase 2 of the menstrual cycle, proliferative phase or the pre-ovulatory phase, which typically lasts from about day 6 to day 14 of the cycle. The rising estrogen levels in the follicle stimulating the regeneration of the endometrium, building of a cushy well, vascularized habitat for another potential fertilized egg to call home. And after the next egg is released, the final secretory or post-ovulatory phase begins. Since when the ruptured follicle forms in the corpus luteum and the fertilization didn't happen, the corpus will stop producing progesterone in the endometrium, will start to shed its functional layer, and it starts all over again. But if by this time the egg has met the nice sperm and gotten fertilized, then the pulse of the progesterone from the corpus triggers even more thickening of the functional layer of the endometrium, and the secretion of the nutrients that will tighten embryo over until it hasn't played itself in the blood-rich lining, which is a big if. But it's a whole separate video. Being so, that's where we're going to go next time, but for now, you learned about all of the female reproductive systems. But for now, you learned all about the female reproductive anatomy, how sex hormones affect oogenesis and population, and how the ovarian and medical cycles mature and releases oocytes and create a comfy and uterine environment for the fertilized egg.